The Pomeranian Incident by J.P. O'Brien. Things on Sycamore Street were, at present, rather tense. Ever since one of Lars Gundersen's Pomeranians had bitten and torn a not insignificant chunk of skin from the older of the two Hershey girls' faces, their mother Lorraine had had an axe to grind against the soft-spoken Norwegian giant next door. Any parent would be upset to see their child hurt. The problem was that Lorraine's fiery indignation had kicked into overdrive. To the community's growing annoyance, she was not shy about making her feelings for her enormous neighbour, or his dangerous, untrained beasts, known to anyone who would listen. It seemed to matter little that the overwhelming majority of the neighbourhood sided with Lars rather than with Daisy Hershey's sharp-tongued mother. This stemmed just as much from how well-liked on Sycamore Street he was as it did from Mrs. Hershey's already polarising reputation as a shrill, domineering busybody, not to mention the fact that the Hershey twins were well known around town for their mischievous behaviour, and, in the considered opinion of the local newspaper editor Ben Radcliffe, probably deserved it. Mr. Radcliffe, who felt his writing talents were largely wasted as a local reporter, quickly found himself being exposed to a lot more of Lorraine's outspoken vitriol than he would have liked. Once she had got as much out of yelling at Lars on his front step as she felt she was going to get, she proceeded to launch a full-blown paper campaign, calling for the termination of not one but both of Lars's dogs, as well as demanding reimbursement for the cost of Daisy's cosmetic surgery. Why she'd chosen his newspaper for her tedious manifesto baffled Ben Radcliffe. To make things worse, upon realising that her letters to the Beacon were ending up straight in his waste paper bin, Lorraine Hershey began putting them directly through the door of his house, opposite hers, instead. This was a convenient way for her to vent her fury, and save on the cost of postage, but it was most inconvenient for the lackadaisical editor, who had no intention whatsoever of bringing even the smallest bit of work into his private home. As for why Ben Radcliffe was relegating all of Lorraine Hershey's letters to the trash in the first place, that actually had nothing to do with his journalistic integrity, or lack thereof. It was purely personal. He was still bitter from when the Hershey twins had unleashed a box of live crickets through the back window of the Beacon's offices the previous summer, and was yet to soften his opinion that the girls were twin terrors. The sound of crickets chirping still put him on edge. Lars Gundersen, meanwhile, was trying to lay as low as possible until the heat of the Pomeranian incident died down. The experience had left him even more quiet and reclusive than normal, and he now spent all of his time in one of two places, either the carpentry workshop in the shed at the bottom of his garden, or in front of his fireplace with his knitting. The only company he sought was that of his beloved dogs, Fjord and Snow, who lay dozing, one apiece, on his size 22 feet. He had originally trained them to sit there in lieu of finding slippers that fit. Lars, of course, knew why Fjord had sunk his teeth into the pink flesh of Daisy Hershey's cheek. It had been self-defense. Over the prior several weeks, it had not escaped his notice that she and her 3-minute younger twin sister Ruby had become fascinated by the sight of the two dogs, scuttling everywhere after their owner and especially riding on his feet on trips up to the shed. Lars would even sometimes spot the tips of their heads ducking behind the fence as he walked by. Ruby's trademark pink bobble hat made her particularly conspicuous. On this occasion, the twins had decided that the two Pomeranians were the perfect ingredient for a pretend coronation in their garden. They were just like the fluffy hats that Russian kings and queens wore, as Ruby would later explain to Adrian Ross in his car. That her daughters had originally provoked the attack mattered little to Mrs. Hershey. Thanks to her long and stressful hours in luxury real estate and a somewhat lax approach to discipline, her twin girls were more or less free to roam around the neighbourhood as they pleased, two pairs of identical beady eyes silently assessing how far they could push their boundaries. When Lars Gundersen emerged from his workshop to investigate a mysterious smashing sound coming from the far end of the garden, the two Pomeranians cautiously edged out too. But a ruby-shaped blur swiped Snow while Lars's mountainous back was turned. He spun around just in time to see Daisy leap from behind a little windmill ornament and make a beeline for Fjord. But before the tiny dog could be snatched, he clamped down hard on the second girl's face, not letting go until a loose flap of her cheek had been all but totally peeled off. The ensuing scream was deafening. Lars Gundersen quickly ushered his 2 dogs back into the house, where he too hid until Lorraine Hershey began banging against his front door several hours later. Imelda Ellsworth had been the first on the scene at the sound of the alarming racket, having been scrubbing the tiles on the front step of her house at the time. She raced across the road in her floral apron and washing-up gloves to find the Hershey twins hurrying out of Mr. Gundersen's side alley in a state of bloody panic. She managed to usher them into the blue Ford of Adrian Ross, fortuitously arriving home at that exact moment from a half-day at the culinary school. Before knowing what was what, the young student chef found himself driving all 4 of them to the emergency room. During that unexpected detour, all Adrian could do was listen to the whimpers of pain coming from his back seat, while Mrs. Ellsworth fanned Daisy with her rubber gloves and tried to calm the hysterical girl down. Meanwhile, Ruby, kneeling up front, described in graphic detail to the squeamish Adrian what precisely had transpired, failing to notice the colour draining from the young man's face. Adrian was simply trying not to faint onto his steering wheel. Shortly after, as he waited outside the hospital's front door for Imelda to get Daisy checked in and looked at, Adrian felt the blood at last return to his cheeks. But they quickly paled again when he realised that this development with his neighbour's dogs might scupper his own secret plans. Adrian was currently in the process of deciding how to propose to his girlfriend, Helena. Knowing how much Helena loved dogs, but aware that they were unable to adopt one of their own just yet, Adrian had been over the moon when he got the idea to borrow a neighbourhood dog and attach his engagement ring to the collar for Helena to find. Fjord and Snow had seemed like the most obvious candidates for the job, given that they were small, cute, and fluffy, and that their agreeable owner Mr. Gundersen was sure to partake in the stunt as long as it was in the name of romance. However, Adrian now suspected the 2 Pomeranians were probably off-limits for any such frivolous use in the immediate future. The only other dog on the street was Dapper, the terrifying beast of a creature belonging to Leona Castellanos, which Adrian was fairly sure wasn't actually a dog at all, but a coyote. The phone call that Lorraine Hershey received in her office that afternoon summoning her to the hospital cannot have been an easy one. Colleagues in surrounding offices would later explain that the expletives they heard from behind her door caused them to hang up their own phones and eavesdrop. Mrs. Hershey had barely calmed down even after returning to Sycamore Street with her daughters a few hours later, even though little Daisy had now been stitched back up and a jagged mark across her face aside seemed totally fine. All of the surrounding neighbours were treated that evening to a verbal onslaught ringing out across the sky. Threats of legal action and demands that the monsters be locked up somewhere far from the neighbourhood, while poor Lars Gundersen just had to stand there on his front step, towering several feet above her, and take it. When, after more than an hour, Lorraine had at last run out of steam to continue her rant, Lars retreated with his dogs inside the house, thoroughly rattled. Though most of his evenings were currently spent in his workshop, carving a wooden storybook for Mrs. Tiny, the school librarian he couldn't quite bring himself to speak to, he didn't dare risk being confronted by Mrs. Hershey again on the short trek up to his shed. So instead, he squeezed into his armchair and picked up his knitting, only to put it down again when he found his enormous shaking hands couldn't hold the needles. In the end, he retreated to his large bed early, clutching the fluffy Fjord and Snow as close as he could to his chest. Over the following days, Lorraine's campaign of fury really took off. Aside from the stream of increasingly passive-aggressive open letters destined for Ben Radcliffe's bin, she also stapled flyers to every telephone pole and lamppost in town. The flyers, photocopied on her lunch break, had been hastily designed to rally support for the motion that there was simply no place on Sycamore Street for wild animals. It would be a few days before she noticed her letters were being willfully ignored by the editor of the Beacon, but the disdain for her flyers was apparent straight off the bat. Leona Castellanos, not yet aware of the Pomeranian Incident, spotted one of Lorraine's flyers while out walking Dapper on his chain the morning they went up, assumed it was directed at him, and proceeded to tear off as many of the flyers as she came across. The teenager then fed the pages into Dapper's razor-sharp teeth until they were nothing more than confetti on the ground. When Lorraine returned from work that night and saw all of the bare telephone poles, she was so blinded by rage she immediately jumped to the ridiculous conclusion that her flyers had been destroyed by none other than that wretched Lars Gundersen himself. Lars, in reality, could barely bring himself to look out of his front window, much less walk to every telephone pole on Sycamore Street, and to ensure his dogs got their regular exercise, had taken to wandering in tiny circles round his kitchen with them instead. He would have quite happily remained hiding within the confines of his property indefinitely, had not Ben Radcliffe's gentle knocking one evening coaxed him out. Ben, apologetic and sympathetic, explained to Lars that Lorraine had now commenced posting her ridiculous letters through his own front door, and might there be anything he could do that would stop this inexcusable infringement? The mistake Ben made was bringing along one of the flyers for Lars to see. Ben had not meant to cause the slightest distress to Lars. He was actually very fond of the man. His uncanny ability to keep to himself was a quality that Mr. Radcliffe particularly admired. He had only wished to get Lorraine Hershey out of his own thinning hair. Once he realised his error, Ben tried to explain that these were just the views of one nutter, but when their conversation, a rather one-sided one since Lars had never been much of a talker, was over, the gentle giant retreated inside, convinced that the entire world hated him. Distraught and tunnel-visioned, he stomped up the garden to his shed and clattered around for a chisel, then let his frustration out on Mrs. Tiny's wooden storybook in a cloud of dust and wood chips. He had become convinced that a monster like him should not be making things so delicate and thoughtful for anyone. He had already destroyed the first 3 pages of his beautiful handiwork before noticing an odd whimpering sound coming from beside his head. He looked up to see Fjord and Snow, sitting in the dog loft he had built them to watch over his workbench, imploring him to stop. Lars broke into tears, dropped the chisel to the ground among the splinters and wood chips, and reached up to gather his beloved companions in his arms. The 2 of them licked at Lars's face as he continued to gently weep. This uncharacteristic outpouring of emotion had been an eye-opener for Lars, and the following day he decided to pay a visit to the ageing Marigold Weatherby a few doors down. Marigold was well known on Sycamore Street for her eccentricity. She wore colourful shawls and clunky beaded jewellery, and carried a whistling canary called Maria Callas atop her wide-brimmed hat. On her walks with the bird, named for the famed soprano, she would hum arias from the operas that she had performed as a young woman, all of which left neighbours shaking their heads in bemused affection. Indeed, when Lars and Marigold occasionally joined one another for walks with their respective animals, it was quite the fantastic spectacle. But Mrs. Weatherby, for all her vibrancy, gave incredibly valuable advice. Her world experience, genuine free spirit, and refreshing disinterest in what people thought of her meant that people often sought out her perspective. Even before Lars came to see her that evening, she had already been made aware of the details of the episode by no fewer than 4 people. Marigold opened her front door to see Lars towering above her. She could immediately tell that he was at the point of tears and quickly hastened him inside for tea and cake. Then, having listened to his account of the conundrum, she told him that Lorraine was undoubtedly a tough egg to crack, so he may find it easier to make peace with the 2 Hershey girls instead. She promised that, in time, the mother would see things differently. Marigold's words rattled around in Lars's head as he walked home, but he remained at a loss as to how he could mend such a tricky bridge. For one, the Hershey twins, despite their tiny size compared to his own, genuinely scared him. There was something unnerving about the way they thought, or schemed might be more appropriate, seemingly from just one mind while still somehow being able to roam around in separate bodies. That was how they had managed to outnumber him in the garden, and so nearly got away with it. Now back in his house with the curtains drawn, he put food in Fjord and Snow's bowls, then squatted down to run his thick fingers through their ginger fluff as they ate. Marigold had heard from Adrian Ross that the girls wanted to use the dogs as hats, but Lars still had no idea why they felt they could just hide in his garden and try to take them. He'd never say it aloud, but he felt it was unfair. Fjord had merely been defending himself from a dog napping. Shouldn't Lorraine be focusing on her own children's lack of discipline, rather than complaining about him to the whole neighbourhood? Then again, Fjord had bitten the poor girl's face. Desperate to clear his mind of it all, Lars turned and went into the living room to settle into his knitting. Knitting was a skill he had learned from his tiny grandmother when he had been a 10-year-old of only 6'2". They spent the dark Norwegian winter nights sitting together in almost total silence, save for the gentle rhythmic clicking of the tips of their needles and the occasional outburst from a cuckoo clock somewhere near the stairs. From the start, Lars appreciated the patience and concentration the hobby demanded, and that practically he would never be short of adequately sized clothes. Though for years he had sent beautiful knitted gifts to Mormor Sigrid to thank her for teaching him the craft, Fjord and Snow were presently the main benefactors of his habit. Their custom-built wardrobe contained more knitted sweaters than was healthy for a pair of Pomeranians. He picked up his latest colourful creation and eased himself into it. As his fingers moved gracefully over the needles and wool, it instantly occurred to him what he should do. For the next 2 days, Lars barely moved from his armchair, fixated on bringing something to life from the hamper of wool by his side. His hands were steady with purpose again, weaving the needles over one another, taking much care and patience with every stitch. Fjord and Snow alternated between sleeping on his bare feet and glancing up at him curiously, well aware that something in him had shifted. Once the knitted component of whatever he was making was complete, he mustered the courage to relocate to the shed for the first time since his destructive eruption, swept the wood chips away, and carefully moved what remained of the storybook for Mrs. Tiny to one side. The Pomeranians watched him as he carved what looked like 2 small bowls, each with an intricate pattern radiating out from a letter in the middle, on one an R and on the other a D. When the gigantic Norwegian emerged from his workshop the following afternoon, it was now his turn to peer over the fence, though admittedly that fence stopped several feet short of his broad shoulders. His heart thumped away in his chest as he waited for the Hershey girls to appear in their garden. Before too long, Ruby, with her pink bobble hat, and Daisy, with the jagged line of fresh stitches across her right cheek, skipped out of their back door to retrieve their bikes. They froze when they saw Lars waving them over. They approached him slowly. Lars cast his eyes awkwardly to the side. He mumbled an apology on his dog's behalf before asking Daisy how she was doing. "Fine," shrugged the girl, rubbing an arm uncomfortably and not quite meeting his gaze. Lars bent down and picked up Fjord. In a tender voice, he said, "He was frightened. He would never hurt a soul, but you did try to steal him." The Pomeranian bared his little teeth over the fence at the children, who each took a step back, until Lars gave him a good-natured shushing and put him down again. He then reappeared above the fence, holding up a beautifully crafted wooden box in his right hand. "Please take this," he said, as he leant over and placed the box in front of the Hershey girls. They stood in stunned silence for a moment. "What is it?" Ruby eventually asked. "Open it," Lars said. The 2 girls kneeled down and looked at each other in a perfect mirror image. They each lifted a corner of the lid of the box on its hinges and looked inside with wide-open mouths. Lars had knitted them each a woolen headband, the same ginger colour as Fjord and Snow, with a skull cap carved from birchwood that sat in the centre of each, a stunning replica of a fur-lined Russian crown. On the front of the skull caps were the girls' initials. "For your coronation," Lars added quietly. "These ones won't bite. I'm very sorry you got hurt." The 2 girls kneeled speechless for a second, but were too excited not to put their gifts on. Ruby put hers on top of her bobble hat. It fit perfectly. Lars turned to leave, before Daisy called out to him to wait. She looked at her sister and then back up at their huge, kindly neighbour. "We're sorry too," she said. "We won't try to take Fjord and Snow again." Lars nodded slowly, then surprised himself by smiling. It was small and tentative, but genuine. "Enjoy," he said, then walked back towards the house, Fjord and Snow stepping along in front of him. He heard Ruby whisper to her sister, "These are even better than the real ones." In time, to everyone's great relief, the events of the Pomeranian incident faded into memory. Lars gradually ventured beyond his garden again, and eventually resumed his walks with Fjord and Snow. Adrian Ross bumped into them one afternoon, although decided it might be best to wait another week or 2 before mentioning his proposal scheme. It would be a little while before Lorraine Hershey finally put away her axe to grind, but, to Ben Radcliffe's delight, her campaign of letters and flyers subsided a lot sooner. He didn't ask questions. Just as Marigold Weatherby had predicted, patching things over with Daisy and Ruby was the correct first step, and their mother softened when she saw how thrilled they were with their thoughtful gifts. In fact, the 2 girls were rarely seen without their crowns for several weeks, long after Daisy's stitches had been taken out. The Hershey twins had perhaps not learned every lesson there was to learn. They would go on to cause plenty more mischief in the future. But they had most definitely learned not to take any Pomeranians that didn't belong to them. Lars was happy to let them come round and play with his dogs from time to time, and after a little tentativeness from both sides, the four grew very fond of each other. And Lars, watching the Hershey twins giggle as the dogs bounded around them, found himself smiling more easily than he had in weeks, happy to see that things on Sycamore Street were, at present, rather peaceful. You have been listening to the By Torchlight podcast. For more, visit patreon.com/bytorchlight or search By Torchlight on Spotify and YouTube.